Thank you for joining our conversation on how work is a human calling. That's just an interesting sentence to say, but what we mean by that is as humans we're created to work. That work was really a gift given to us by God. Sometimes our work is hard and troubling, but work in and of itself is really a gift, and it's part of who people are as made in the image of God, reflecting who He is in the world. Work is something that we've come to learn about a little bit at Plant with Purpose over the years. I don't think that we initially started with the intention of talking about work as part of a big part of our faith. I'm Christy Renaud. I'm the Director of Marketing and Development here at Plant with Purpose. I've been here for about 10 years now. Have done a lot of work in the field with our program partners, have done some work with our donors here in the United States, and have seen this conversation play out in a lot of different ways. And I'm here joined with Scott Sabin, our CEO, who's also been a long-time part of this conversation. So Scott, would you begin by just kind of telling us how you started thinking about work and faith?
Yeah, well, it's funny because, as you said, this is not something I originally thought a lot about, but I think for me, a really key moment came in the late 90s on an early trip to Haiti. And we used to stay in this guest house out near our field office, which was out in the countryside. There was no electricity. So we'd sit around after dark telling stories, and I mean, it was pitch black. And we were working, there was a group of about 4 of us. We were working with this Episcopal priest, Father Wilfred Albert, and amazing guy. But he came walking up and joined us one night, and he had started all these schools and churches out in this remote parish. He'd been kind of exiled up there, but had started, I think it was 12 schools or 30, I don't remember. Anyway, a lot of schools. And he was the kind of guy who, when he talked, you listened. And so he came there that night, and I remember him going around the story, and he says, or around the circle, he says, it's as if God came to each of us and said, I have something really important for you to do. And Father Albert was a really childlike guy, so he said, you'd hear that and you'd be so happy, you'd be happy. But he said, what if instead, when he came to you, he said, I have nothing to do for you. In fact, you can't even feed your own family. And that was the first time I ever thought how horrible it would feel to think that you had nothing to contribute. But I also began to think, but God doesn't say that to anybody. I think about the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. And in the parable of the talents, the landlord, as Jesus is telling the parable, the landlord gives one person 1 talent, one person 3, and one person 5. And from a justice perspective, I never understood why the person who only received 1 was the person who buried their talent. It didn't seem fair. I mean, why is, in this case, Jesus calling out the poor person who's burying their talent instead of the rich person who could just as easily have buried the and if it's just about using your talents, it doesn't change the story. But the more I've traveled and the more I've talked to subsistence farmers and the very poor, the more I realize that they're the ones who may not recognize their own talents, who might believe that they don't have anything to contribute, and so in fear bury that. And I've come to realize that a part of the gospel, part of the good news is God gives everybody something to contribute, everybody something to invest on behalf of the kingdom. And so if we can counteract that narrative, the narrative that you've got nothing to contribute. And I think one of the dangers with a lot of humanitarian work and especially things that rely on handouts or coming to do something for people is it takes away that work and reinforces that message that you have nothing to contribute. And if we can counteract that, we're sharing the gospel in that respect.
Yeah, I've heard you deliver a few sermons about that too, and focus really largely on the parable of the talents. And I've watched the whole crowd hear that story and just be like, yeah, So it's definitely a big one that resonates with a lot of people. What I found in my experience was similar. Probably in Africa. I spent a few years living and working in Africa before I joined Plant with Purpose, and even in my first few years here. I sat in a church service once, and it was the most awkward experience of my life because I didn't fully understand everything that the pastor was saying, but I got a lot of it. And I remember the whole church stopping and staring at me, and I was like, wait, what are we talking about? So I asked the person that I was sitting next to kind of summarize what the pastor had just said, and what he said is, if you would just have more faith, you would be wealthy. And then he pointed out to me, the one white person in the crowd, and said, look, she's American. In her country, they obviously have so much faith because they're wealthy. And I remember thinking, no, that's just not true. It did not make any logical sense. But once I started to hear it, I heard it more and more. And what I realized is across the entire world, not in any particular location more than any others necessarily, but across the whole world, this lie has seeped into a lot of popular teaching that kind of makes faith a little bit more like, if you do these things, if you put maybe prayer or extra money into the bucket of your faith, that what you will sow is health and prosperity and wealth, and that God is a bit like a piggy bank. You put this in, you get something out, and that's just not the God that I know, and it's not the God that I read. It's not Jesus. But yet it still is there, and what I've seen is the impact that has on a rural, poor farming family like the one that we partner with, is to just say, God's not here. And I hear that coming from people, because if God blesses you financially always, and you're poor, then God must not be here. God must have forgotten about you. And that, it's a bit of a logical stretch, but so many people go there. And for that reason, or for so many others, as I've talked to our partner families, and I've talked to a lot of people living in remote parts of the world, and the many places that I've lived, I've heard this message over and over again, that if I'm poor, it must mean that God doesn't care, that God's forgotten me. Maybe God is somewhere else right now. And it's just sad, because I know that our God is a God of compassion, and his heart aches in longing for bringing these people back, and he also sees them in their pain. If you look at who Jesus was, Jesus always stopped when he was moved by compassion.
Yeah.
And that's the God that we serve. So what do you say to those people? How do you counteract that? And that's where I started encountering theology of work, is when I started to see how thinking about work and talking about how God is calling us to join him in making something of the world, and he's calling us as his co-workers to build and to create and to make the world a better place, how empowering that is to someone who's been told that their poverty is a sign of God's lack of care.
Yeah.
Because it's not true.
The prosperity gospel that you're talking about, the other impact of that is to create a real fatalism. God's going to grant me a miracle if I just sit back. You told me a story once about a farmer you'd encountered that I think epitomized that really well. What was it he said?
Yeah, this is when I was in Tanzania. It was a really remote area. This guy, I just found him in his field. I was looking for him because he owed a bunch of money to the bank that I was working for, and came there to engage a conversation with him, and asked, well, we had given you all of these inputs and we gave you all of these things. Why didn't you do anything with them? You'd be able to repay us if you did something with them. And I mean, that whole thing aside, our model of savings groups is so much better, but that whole thing aside, his response stuck with me. And his response was, I've watched people labor. I've watched people work their land, and I've watched people fail and we all just laugh at them. But I know if I sit under this mango tree long enough, a mango's gonna fall. and that was his response. And I didn't have anything to say to that. I just walked away and took notes and added that to my calculations of whether or not we were gonna get that loan back. But yeah, just a story of, I think the reason why that story stuck with me is that guy was willing to say that, but I wonder how many more people think that way. That if the purpose of my labor is to bring wealth, and that's all that it's for, and I know that I'm fighting an uphill battle, like the people that we partner with, they're farming the land that nobody else wants. They're farming the land that is the hardest to farm, and that's the only way they're going to make a living. So they're literally fighting an uphill battle.
Yeah.
And yeah, why should you work? The chances of your work being in vain or not producing huge amounts of results is high. Yeah. That's gonna to come back and fail. So what we've found at Plant with Purpose is when we've turned that around and just talked about, well, what does work look like in the Bible? What is the story that God's invited us into? We see that people are much more willing to try, to take risks and to do something that otherwise, it's likely to fail, but I'll give it a shot. Yeah. And that's the beginning of hope. I was just thinking about, well, if that is what we're thinking and how we're thinking, what does the Bible have to say about work? And just some of the things that I've seen along the way that really stand out to me is, Jesus worked. Jesus worked all the time, and Jesus's work, I think, is a great model for our work because it was focused on others. Almost always it wasn't selfish. He was always building towards something better. He wasn't trying to hoard his wealth. He was trying to build and create a movement of people, but he was also trying to make the world a better place. He would stop and respond in compassion to people who were suffering. But he worked hard. He wasn't afraid of work. And then if you go back even further, the creation story is a great one because that's God modeling making something out of nothing. And then the end of that story is especially beautiful because then he makes people and then he gives us the gift of work. He calls us to be his co-workers in creating something out of what we've got and creating a beautiful story. And so, yeah, I think in that whole story, we see an entirely different way to think about why it is that we work. It's not about survival necessarily, although it leads to survival. It's not about me getting ahead and trying to accumulate the most. It's something else. And I think sometimes God created some things that don't seem to necessarily have a functional purpose. It's not utilitarian. Sometimes work is about creating beauty.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's one of the things it means to be made in the image of God, is having that creative spirit and being able to create beauty and work and creativity go hand in hand, or at least they should go hand in hand. Another part of the bad theology I hear sometimes, especially related to the prosperity gospel, is that work is a curse, that it's the result of the fall that you'll have to work. And as you pointed out, no, work predates the fall, and it becomes a lot harder after the fall. But I think that, like I said, creativity and work really go hand in hand.
One of the things that I love is hearing stories of disabled people in our communities, because I think that those are the stories that most maximize kind of the radical shift in how we work. In a lot of the developing world especially, labor is hard work. You got to get up and you got to physically go climb a mountain and cultivate that land, or you've got to walk really, really far to get to market carrying huge loads on your back. And if you've got a physical disability, that's just not really an option for you. And so a lot of times disabled people are just at home and they're receivers of charity.
Yeah.
And what we've found in Plant with Purpose is that as we've been talking about work and calling and vocation and kind of trying to flip this script around so that work is a good thing and work is a gift, that we find that then the disabled people start saying, well, what about me too? So We just got a story a couple weeks ago out of Congo from a lady named Veronica, who, her story is just tragic. She had a disease 7 years ago that left her partially paralyzed, definitely a lot less mobile. She also lost an eye, which I think was a very visible sign of her disability. And she was abandoned. Her family left her. And I mean, she was surviving, so somebody was still caring for her. It's not that tragic a story, but she was a receiver of charity. And she felt like there was no point left in her life. And yeah, in her story, she mentions that she thought this was the end. There's nothing left to live for. And then she heard us talk about work, and she thought, wait, there's things that I can do. And her community came around her and said, there's things that you can do. And so now she has a little vegetable and fish stand that she doesn't have to go anywhere for. People can come to her. And she's actually managed to save $100 so far, which is huge for somebody who probably is in an area where the average person eats one meal a day. $100 is a lot of money. So that's really exciting and encouraging. But the bigger piece is just to hear how switching up what work is brought her back into community with people. And I think that's a big piece of the stories that I hear. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I think about how my appreciation for this has grown, and a lot of it came from Burundi originally, and then I've seen more examples in Congo. But our original founder in Burundi, Lazar, had a PhD in theology and first introduced me to the term theology of work. But we were at the time working with a lot of returning refugees, people coming back from Tanzania, where they had sometimes been in refugee camps for 20 or 30 years, and the Tanzanian government didn't want them to settle, and so prohibited them from working. And so you've got people coming back who maybe are 30 years old and never worked, never done anything productive, have been taking handouts, and not very generous ones, their whole life. And we were having trouble getting people excited about agricultural training and about savings groups. That same attitude that you described with the Tanzanian farmer. You know, wait for something to fall out of the tree. And so we started teaching that work was a gift from God, that everybody had something to contribute. And it took off like wildfire. And pretty soon we had more churches wanting the theology of work training than we could possibly come alongside with savings groups and the agricultural training. So they were still struggling with where do we go next. But once we crossed the border into Congo, this is where it really became real and meaningful to me. We in about 2016 or so took a hike. If the original watershed we were working in, Kakumba watershed, has about a 7,000 feet elevation difference between the lowest community and the highest community. And we took 3 days and hiked between these 6 villages where we were piloting. And Barori told me that a lot of people are going to be curious. And so there are going to be people who follow us on the road. And there was about 50 men who walked with us. And the last night we all camped together. And I learned that there are people from different ethnic groups and different village chiefs and government officials and pastors. And it was a really, for them, an amazing time, because there hadn't been that many people gathered in peace in that area in a long time. But the other thing that Barori told me, he says, you know the guy you've been walking with for the last 2 days who's been helping you carry your stuff? Yeah, he was the local guerrilla leader. So I asked if I could interview him, and as we sat down that night, this guy, Kataki was his name, says, part of the story I always forget to set up, but it's really important to know, the men in this part of Congo and in much of East Africa don't do a lot of work. The women carry the brunt of everything. They're the ones who are doing the farming. And oftentimes you see the men sitting around or drinking. And that was what he said to me. He said, you know, we didn't do much. We'd sit around and play cards. But then your pastor came, and started talking about work being a gift from God. And I thought, maybe if I help my wife on the farm, together we could do something great. And he said it with such enthusiasm. And then he went on to talk about disbanding the militia. And I was trying to get at, you know, what was the spiritual change? So I said, so did you become a Christian? And he says, no, I've always been a Christian. I grew up in the church. I got baptized in the church. I got married in the church. I just never realized it applied to anything besides Sunday before. And as I've gotten to know his story more, and as I heard more from him, he's discovered that he has purpose, that he has real talents that he can give, and that he has become a leader and a real ambassador for peace in those communities. And so that cultural transformation that came as he realized, I have something to contribute, caused a real transformation in the way I see work.
The cool thing about that story, it reminds me of several others too, where I wonder, I mean, we're talking about work and we're talking about the Bible, and I'm thinking, is this just a utilitarian way to get you to try things that you wouldn't try otherwise? I mean, I have seen that when we lead with theology of work, it's so much easier to get that adoption in participation of trying our new techniques in regenerative agriculture and things like that. So part of me wonders, is this just utilitarian, or what's the spiritual impact coming from my bias of, is this going to improve someone's personal walk with God? And it does. And that surprises me regularly. Just heard another story from Burundi of a lady who's a little bit older. She's probably in her 60s, and so probably an elderly lady there in a lot of aspects. But her story was just tragic. She had 11 children, and all of her boys and one of her daughters were killed in the war. And then she just lost everything, and she was left really, really poor. And what she said is the combination of listening to theology of work, rethinking what work is, that work is actually a part of living out my faith, and then combining that with prayer and taking action to heal my land. She said it described the soul scar, or it healed her soul scar. And I thought that was a really interesting term, but that just the prayer and just understanding who God is, that wasn't enough to lead to the healing, but it took kind of transforming some of the poverty and transforming some of the way that she thought about the purpose of her labor.
Right.
That really led to that healing. Her story is also one of those great ones, because now she has 3 cows, which are a sign that she called it I'm a made woman. And I thought that was really cool. So she's no longer that lady to be pitied, because
Right.
she has this tragic history, but now, yeah, she's got standing in her community. She connected her house to electricity, which required a huge investment that she was able to do by building her farm. She also connected it to the sewer pipes and the water system, so she has clean water piped into her house, and just a lot of these things that make her quality of life a lot better. And the really cool part of her story is she's dreaming so big now that she's building another house because she wants to become a landlord. And so I just keep thinking, I wouldn't have pictured that at the beginning of her story, of a lady who had just kind of given up to despair.
Yeah.
And now she's dreaming huge. And so it's really cool to see how that link of hard work paying off, and prayer, and really sincerely chasing God leads to a new type of healing.
Yeah, well, one of the things you just mentioned is the purpose of her labor. And it's not just about making money, and it's not just about becoming prosperous. I think that part of the theology of work is that part of the purpose of our labor is to love God by loving our neighbors. And that's one of the things we measure when we're trying to measure our spiritual impact, is how frequently do people help their neighbors. And that's one of the things that we see again and again is people helping their neighbors more frequently, and discovering purpose in that. Realizing, and I know I say this a lot, but realizing that they have a role to play in God's redemptive purposes, which to me is incredibly empowering. I know that that's what gets me up in the morning, is knowing that I'm not just going through my work today for my paycheck or for my reputation or even for my family, but rather God has given all of us the privilege of participating in what He's doing to redeem the world. And that's, you know, how much more exciting can it get than that? Yeah.
Yeah, and kind of going back to, so work is not, I mean, work is good for helping to make sure that I can meet my basic needs.
Right.
Work is good for getting ahead, but that's not necessarily all that it's for. It's part of living out who we are as God. It's part of the way that we create community. It's part of the way that we create a society and a world that honors our God and points to who He is. It's part of, just making beauty and joy and blessing others, I think is a really big piece. We find that, I've heard this story across all of our country programs over and over again. It usually comes from someone who's a little bit older and says, I started planting trees, and what got me to think about planting trees was when I started to realize that the purpose of planting those trees isn't to gain more wealth, because at my age I'm not going to see the fruits of those trees. I'm not going to be able to harvest them for timber or maybe even eat their fruit, but I want to be here to bless the generations that come beyond me. I want to bless my neighbors. I want to bless my community, and so I'm planting trees. And that's just a beautiful story, but it got me looking at my backyard. I don't own my home, I rent, I live in San Diego, and my backyard it could be improved using a lot of the things that we teach. And I've often been a little bit lazy to invest heavily in somebody else's property, but I think that that's what God calls us to do, is to not just invest where we're going to reap the benefits, but to invest for the purpose of investing in healing the land, creating a larger society, and blessing others around us.
Yeah.
So all in all, it's just a fascinating story that changes the way that we think about ourselves.
And changes the way we think about the people that we work with. You know, as you well know, our core message is that the people we serve are our partners. They're not our projects. And everything we do, everything that Plant with Purpose in the U.S. does, is multiplied thousands of times over because we have people working alongside us. You know, the other thing that comes to my mind is when we change the name of the organization to Plant with Purpose, I don't think we'd fully thought through what planting with purpose means. But the more I think about this topic, the more I realize that that's what we're doing, is helping people not just to plant, not just to reforest and improve their farms and restore watersheds, but to plant with a greater purpose, to plant with purpose.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks again for joining us in this talk. If you want to learn more about theology of work, search for it. There's a lot of wonderful books written on the topic. Also, you can pick up your Bible and kind of reread it from cover to cover, thinking about what is God saying in terms of the purpose of our labor, and you'll find that to be a fulfilling experience. Check us out at plantwithpurpose.org for more stories of transformation like we talked about today. And think about ways that you can take action in your community and rethink how you think about work in your daily life and apply that here at home. You might find that it transforms your life in the same way that it transforms the lives of our partners around the world. Thanks again.